Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Poetry Thursday, an embattled little BookTube tradition that I have neglected for a little bit. Sorry, we'll get back to that now. We are working our way through one book, this thing, 20th Century American Poetry. We are that far. We have barely skipped anybody. I think in this entire course of this book, I've only skipped one poet. And it was because that poet insisted on writing in Negro dialect, in old style Negro dialect. And I thought there was very little point in doing that, even when that poet was doing it. And to put it mildly, there's no point in me doing it in 2024. So I just skipped that entire person, but I don't think I've skipped anybody else. There are authors coming up I'm very much going to want to skip, but I won't. Today is not one of them. Today is, I think, if I'm guessing correctly, I'm doing a mental note. I'm trying not to look ahead in the table of contents on this thing. But if I'm doing a mental note just of my knowledge of 20th century American poetry, I think there is one poet after this who I will enjoy reading. And all the rest, no. I think there's one after this. We are dealing with one of, in my opinion, the last great poets that this book will give us, and that is Elizabeth Bishop, the great Massachusetts poet, Elizabeth Bishop, who she is fantastic. Her word choice, her concepts are fantastic. But nevertheless, she is, like a couple of other poets that we have seen, a harbinger of things to come, a harbinger of what's going to make the last third of this book excruciating for me, and I'm going to make it excruciating for you. uh, what that is multi-part, and it's nuanced, and maybe it will change. Maybe the read-through of this book will change my perception of that. It would be terrific if it did. But in the meantime, Elizabeth Bishop is not that in the power of her verse, in the insightfulness of her verse, but nevertheless, in some of the technical execution of her verse, she is a harbinger of what's coming. This anthology includes mostly long poems, so I'm going to read one of those. I don't think it'll take that long because the lines are very short. This is In a Waiting Room. It's called In the Waiting Room, and it's from 1976. And I'm going to need to tell you when I'm starting and stopping because you're not going to know otherwise that I'm reading poetry as opposed to just reading a block of somebody's memoir, which is part of the problem. But so I'm starting now. In Worcester, Massachusetts, I went to Aunt Consuelo to keep her dentist appointment and sat and waited for her in the dentist's waiting room. It was winter. It got dark early. The waiting room was full of grown-up people, Arctics and overcoats, lamps and magazines. My aunt was inside what seemed like a long time, and while I waited, I read the National Geographic. I could read. And carefully studied the photographs. The inside of a volcano, black and full of ashes. Then it was spilling over in rivulets of fire. Osa and Martin Johnson dressed in riding breeches, laced boots, and pith helmets. A dead man slung on a pole. The long pig, the caption said. Babies with pointed heads, wound round and round with string. Black naked women with necks wound round and round with wire, like the necks of light bulbs. Their breasts were horrifying. I read it right straight through. I was too shy to stop. And then I looked at the cover, the yellow margins, the date. This is describing an issue of National Geographic. Suddenly, from inside came an O of pain. Aunt Consuelo's voice, not very loud or long. I wasn't at all surprised. Even then I knew she was a foolish, timid woman. I might have been embarrassed, but wasn't. What took me completely by surprise was that it was me, my voice in my mouth. Without thinking at all, I was my foolish aunt. We were falling. Falling. Our eyes glued to the cover of the National Geographic, February 1918. I said to myself, 3 days and you'll be 7 years old. I was saying it to stop the sensation of falling off the round, turning world into cold blue-black space. But I felt, you are an I, you are an Elizabeth, you are one of them. Why should you be one, too? I scarcely dared to look to see what it was I was. I gave a sidelong glance. I couldn't look any higher. At shadowy gray knees, trousers and skirts and boots and different pairs of hands lying under the lamps. I knew that nothing stronger had ever happened, that nothing stranger Nothing stranger had ever happened, that nothing stranger could ever happen. Why should I be my aunt, or me, or anyone? What similarities, boots, hands, the family voice I felt in my throat, or even the National Geographic and those awful hanging breasts, held us together or made us all just one? How, I didn't know any word for it, how unlikely, how hard how had I come to be here, like them, and overhear a cry of pain that could have been got loud and worse, but hadn't. The waiting room was bright and too hot. It was sliding beneath a big black wave, another and another. Then I was back in it. The war was on, outside in Worcester, Massachusetts, where were night and slush and cold, and it was still the 5th of February, 1918. Okay, so that is obviously a childhood memory. Elizabeth Bishop is remembering being a little girl. It's very neat the way the poem eases us into that reality, the lived reality of the narrator. She's remembering being a little girl. She's remembering being in that waiting room when she suddenly has a weird, expansive thought that takes her out of the bounds of her own self as someone who's about to be 7, and then back in the final bit of that the long middle stanza hints that maybe she passes out in the waiting room and comes back to herself. Maybe not. One of those black waves that she feels, where she feels herself sliding and sliding. Maybe the room is too warm. But it's a personal memory of being there. And we are, I think, safe in assuming that the little girl, Elizabeth, had no such thoughts in that room. In other words, Elizabeth Bishop is taking these persistent glimpses of memory, probably that sound of her aunt, that sound of the look of that National Geographic issue, maybe the glimpses of knees and hands on knees and whatnot. All those are very, very much the type of fragment of a memory that people have of very early childhood. It's very likely that she's taking those fragments and adding on the middle bit about how the little girl suddenly feels, why am I a me instead of an I or a they, and maybe I'm all of that too. And it's done really well. She takes that childhood memory, those glimpses, those flashes. She doesn't explain them internally inside the poem any more than she absolutely needs to, but she does do what she absolutely needs to. She locates it in a time and place. She locates herself at an age. Locates the people around her. The war is on, etc., etc. She takes that and then she deepens it. The poet's way of deepening things. Okay. It isn't any kind of verse, which is why I read it like prose. It isn't any kind. There is nothing that dictates when the lines break, no matter what people tell you about this or any other kind of poem like this. There is nothing that dictates, nothing metric, nothing rhythmical that dictates when the lines break, where the stresses fall. Nothing at all. This is prose broken up into a vertical tower. It's really, really effective. It would be just as effective as a paragraph of prose. It's really, really effective. It's really beautifully done. But it's a harbinger. Because what if it weren't beautifully done? What if it were just humdrum? And what if, in addition to being just humdrum prose that for some whimsical reason is stacked vertically, what if in addition to that, it didn't ground itself in any kind of surrounding material? What if you were just getting flashes of light, hands on knees, wire around nipples, but no context that the wire around nipples is in National Geographic, that the hands on knees belong to adults in a waiting room at a dentist's office? What if you didn't get that? What if those details that ground the story and allow you to put it in your mind, what if those weren't there? And it was mediocre. Well, there's no reason to ask that as hypothetical because we're going to get that. But for now, with this anthology, I was able to bask in the rest of her poetry, which is all wonderful. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I think we have rocky sailing ahead, but we'll find out next Thursday. So I will end this here, and I will see you then. Thank you, Muthu.